The 50-48 vote for Kavanaugh is the narrowest in a generation, and it came as protesters descended on Capitol Hill. Donald Trump praised Kavanaugh before heading to a rally tonight in Kansas.
He will be a great justice of the Supreme Court. People have thought that for 10 years. They thought he's just an extraordinary person, a great talent, and I think he's going to make us all very proud.
Trump tweeted that Kavanaugh will officially be sworn in tonight, though not in public. Instead, the swearing in will be done by Chief Justice John Roberts and retired Justice Anthony Kennedy in a private ceremony.
The nomination of Brett M. Kavanaugh of Maryland to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States is confirmed.
But first, let's take a look at the protests underway right outside the U.S. Supreme Court. Kavanaugh is inside, and NBC's Mike Vaquera is there. Mike, tell us what you're seeing.
I don't know what else to say. The day was petering out. The crowd was thinning out. There's been a crowd down at the Supreme Court. That's okay. Down there, where you see on the sidewalk, Kavanaugh chanting, and then Ronnie, let's turn around and look at the door here. And then this moment, just as they did at the Capitol, to the top of the steps of the Supreme Court, and now besieging the front door of the Supreme Court. I don't recall ever seeing a scene like this. Obviously, a lot of passion in this crowd. Whether or not this carries over to November is a distinction that nobody is really concerned with at the minute. It's getting hard to hear in here as we wade into the crowd, but just an extraordinary moment, Joy, capping 2 weeks of civil action, of civil
only the universal union, that small
senators,
minds call the
as they walk through the halls of the Russell Building, the Hart Building, the Dirksen Building, in restaurants. This is the culmination of all of that, an outpouring of raw emotion and anger on the part of these protesters, Joy.
NBC's Mike Vaquera, thank you very much. Let's bring in NBC's Casey Hunt on Capitol Hill. Casey, what are you seeing there?
Well, Joy, this is an incredibly divided Senate, and you're seeing on screen right now the fact that the country is also incredibly divided over this. I mean, what were already deep divisions in the Trump era have really turned into open wounds in the wake of this Kavanaugh fight. And, you know, Senator Jeff Flake said that the Senate has hit rock bottom in terms of its relationships and the institution itself, which has a long tradition of bipartisanship, working together. And a lot of the senators that I've been talking to just don't feel as though that was the case here. And this, by percentage, was the narrowest Supreme Court justice vote in history, in American history. And you can really tell that here. So, you know, I think there's a lot of questions going forward about how this affects the midterm elections. I think you're going to see a lot more scenes like this, potentially, as we get closer to that, because, frankly, both sides are now more energized. Republicans feel as though this fight has done something that they couldn't do by themselves, which is energize the Republican base and get them excited about getting out to the polls in November. I think their question now is whether that lasts. Mitch McConnell said he called the protesters the mob and said that's what it is that's driving Republicans potentially to the polls. Again, question is, does that hold? I think for Democrats, this does a couple things. It potentially makes the path much easier in the House. The suburban women that were already going to be making the difference in terms of control of the House of Representatives are, if anything, more energized and angered about this, helping them win there. But the map on the Senate side is much different, and their path is through incumbent senators who are sitting in red states. And so they are more worried than ever now about whether or not they'll be able to hang on, or perhaps Mitch McConnell will be able to actually grow his majority in the Senate. Joy.
Thank you very much, Casey Hunt. What you're looking at now is Donald Trump disembarking from Air Force One in Topeka, Kansas, where he is planning to hold a rally. Trump tweeting just moments ago that the crowd in front of the Supreme Court is tiny, so he says. Looks like about 200 people, and he says most are onlookers that wouldn't even fill the first couple of rows in our Kansas rally or any of our rallies at that matter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Let's move on. He's saying that the crowd isn't big, but we can actually see it. So don't believe the tweet. Believe what you're seeing with your own eyes. There are the pictures again. Doesn't look like a tiny crowd to me. Let's bring in NBC's chief White House correspondent, Hallie Jackson. So, Hallie, the President of the United States pretending that he does not see that there is a huge crowd, not just in Capitol Hill, but outside of the Supreme Court as well. I'm looking at quotes from an interview he gave on Air Force One in which he dismissed the idea that women are actually angered by the Kavanaugh nomination. What are you hearing from the White House?
Yeah, a couple of things here, Joe. So he's actually, his view is that people are outraged about, women in particular are mad, he believes, about what happened to Brett Kavanaugh, right? That this has actually galvanized women in his view. At least that's what he's telling reporters as he is just now getting off Air Force One.
Hallie, hold on just 1 second.
Yeah.
I hate to interrupt. I'm going to come back to you. Trump is speaking now.
What he's had to endure, horrible, false statements, it doesn't get any worse. But the beautiful thing is he is now in. He's going to be there for a long time, and he's just an outstanding intellect, outstanding scholar, brilliant lawyer, brilliant at everything he's ever done. So we're very happy, and the vote was it was a great vote, a very historic vote. I just spoke to him 2 minutes ago, and I spoke to the justice's family, and he's so excited. So we have now Justice Kavanaugh, and he's a terrific man, terrific person. I just congratulated him. I said, congratulations. It was well fought. I mean, who would have thought a thing like that could have happened, what he's been through? Everything was uncorroborated. I want to thank the FBI. I thought the FBI was incredible. They worked hard, and they worked really fast. And I hear the report was really a detailed, thorough, professional report. So I want to thank them. I want to thank the Justice Department, because they were working along with the FBI really hard, really fast. And I think this actually, the extra week delay was a terrific thing for the process. So we have a great new Supreme Court justice, and he's going to be there for many years. We are very, very proud of him and what he and his family had to endure. And it's a great testament, and it's a testament also to our country. I'm going to make a speech. I'll be talking about it a little bit. I know you'll all be there. So thank you very much. Thank you. No, not at all. No, no. Great talent. Great man. Thank you.
Okay, we'll wait till Mike is back on. Mike, we have the President of the United States in a bit of gaslighting there, trying to say that the protests are really people who are angry at what happened, in his view, to Brett Kavanaugh, not people who are angry that Brett Kavanaugh has been nominated to the Supreme Court. You're out there in the crowd. Have you found many protesters who are upset on behalf of Brett Kavanaugh? Do we have Mike Vaquera? Okay, I don't think we have Mike Vaquera. Let me get Hallie Jackson back. Hallie, we're looking at the protests, Hallie. We can see them. We now have police heading up the steps of the Supreme Court. You see a lot of people there waving flags, a lot of very passionate, angry people. I don't know if you've been down on the Capitol steps or up the Supreme Court steps, but Donald Trump would like the country to believe that those protests are people who are upset about what happened to Brett Kavanaugh, not about the fact that Brett Kavanaugh was credibly accused of sexual assault and is yet on the court. Which of those two things is true in your reporting?
I mean, I'm looking at exactly what you're looking at here, signs that say we believe women that clearly appear to be anti-Kavanaugh protests. That's why they're there. That's what they're doing. We can see that here. I think it was notable what the president just said. And one thing, just to step back a little and put this in perspective, he said, you know, he talked to Brett Kavanaugh just within the last couple of minutes. We know that at some point in the coming hours, Brett Kavanaugh will be sworn in as the next Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. And the president said he's going to be there a long time. And here's the thing, he will be. Brett Kavanaugh, likely for decades after Donald Trump is out of office, because there is a finite time period that will happen, right? But Brett Kavanaugh, long after that, will remain on the Supreme Court and will be part of the Trump administration legacy. That is a major victory for Donald Trump. He knows it. That, I think, Joy, is why you're seeing him so eager to talk to the press. He came back. He, first of all, called Phil Rucker over at the Washington Post on Air Force One. He was calling senators. He came back and talked with reporters on Air Force One. He got off the plane and stopped and talked with reporters again. He's now going to a rally where he is going to talk about this yet another time as these protests are happening. The president, I'm told from sources that I talked to at the White House, is feeling confident and optimistic about how this relates to the midterms, how this relates to November, because he's been looking at the polling. This is a president who likes to know about the polls. You know that. That's been true since his campaign. He's looking at the numbers and seeing Republican intensity and enthusiasm that has spiked. He said something very interesting on the plane, Joy. He said that he believed that Mississippi speech he gave, remember when he mocked Christine Blasey Ford for her accusation against Judge Brett Kavanaugh, he thinks that made, in his view, an important difference in all of this, believing, presumably, that it galvanized Republicans. The question is whether that's a sugar high or whether that sustains through November, as we're watching some of these scenes here from Washington tonight.
Yeah, indeed, Holly. Thank you very much. Let's go back to Mike Vaccaro, who's actually in that crowd. Mike, we saw the police were heading up the steps of the Supreme Court. A lot of protesters there. You've been in the thick of that today. Donald Trump seems to believe that there is as much, or maybe more, in his view, passion on behalf of Brett Kavanaugh as against him. You're out there. Which is it?
Well, right now we're trying to avoid being arrested on the Capitol steps. As you can see, the police are, they're not arresting people, but they've sort of formed a human cordon to move people down. There's one inspector sort of forcefully telling people to get off the steps. You know, again, a distinction. All right. There's a distinction that people are making that people are not making here about the politics, whether there's a backlash, whether there's the tactics like this are going to backfire. I think it's fairly obvious from the pictures and the sounds that you're seeing right now that is a distinction that's well beyond many of these folks. You just feel like you're in a moment here, Joy, and I know the Republicans, Ted Cruz, Mitch McConnell, and the president look at these pictures and they think it's good for them politically. Everybody needs a foil, whether they're right, whether they're wrong. I'm not in a position to make that judgment right now, but I can tell you that this is an incredibly passionate crowd, an incredibly passionate culmination to 2 weeks of protests, both outside and inside the halls of the United States Senate. Joy.
Yeah. And Mike Vaccaro, stay with me just for one more moment. Have you ever seen anything like these kinds of protests tied to a Supreme Court nomination before?
I have to say, it was the end of the day. The sun's starting to go down. The crowd was thinning out somewhat. I thought it was they were losing energy, and then suddenly a swarm, these protesters, running up the steps of the Supreme Court in almost identical fashion to how they did earlier in the day on the east front of the U.S. Capitol. So a lot of passion. I mean, it goes without saying. Look in the faces of these protesters. An extraordinary moment, Joy. I've been a journalist in Washington for 28 years. I wasn't reporting during the 60s, but I don't recall ever seeing a scene like this where protesters literally go and knock on the front door of the Supreme Court. Joy.
All right, NBC's Mike Vaccaro. Thank you very much. Be careful out there, Vic. And now let's go to NBC's Jeff Bennett, who's in Topeka, Kansas, where Donald Trump will hold a campaign rally later tonight. Jeff, the president and members of the Republican side in the United States Senate seem to think it is an unambiguously good thing for them that this nomination went through today. They do not seem to recognize that there is another side. They believe that the women who are protesting for Brett Kavanaugh, and they believe that this is a win-win-win going into November. Tell us what you're hearing in that crowd. Right. Is there any consciousness among that crowd that there are people who are incredibly devastated by what happened today?
In a word, Joy, no. I've seen people wearing shirts that say #Kavanaugh strong emblazoned across the front. In the zero-sum game of politics, a win is a win. And remember, the specter of Donald Trump cementing a conservative majority on the court for a generation is really the thing that really got him, cemented a coalition of conservatives behind him, even those people who had misgivings about Donald Trump, the man. So you're seeing protests there on the Capitol Hill and at the Supreme Court. Here in Kansas, the state that Donald Trump won by some 20 points, it's the exact opposite. In fact, we caught up with some Trump supporters outside of the Kansas Expo Center where I'm speaking to you to ask what they thought about all of this. Here's what they told us.
He's a constitutional judge, and because he seems to be a person that takes everybody's situation seriously and tries to be very fair. He's a good family man.
If I was a man, I would listen to it, because if my girlfriend gets mad at me and accuses me of something, am I automatically guilty? Am I going to the pokey?
So in this Me Too moment, the cultural reckoning that it is, I think it's safe to say that any lessons learned from that have fallen on deaf ears when it comes to President Trump. On Air Force One, he was asked, he talked about the message to young men, what's the message to women? And the president told the reporters gathered there that, in fact, tremendous numbers of women, as he put it, are, in fact, scared for their brothers, sons, and uncles in the cases that they might be wrongly accused. I'm paraphrasing here. So the president and his supporters are claiming this as a win. Frankly, it seems like an inappropriate thing to sort of characterize it, given the personal trauma on Dr. Ford and the political wound it has opened in our country. But certainly that's one of the things we expect the president to talk about when he takes the stage. You can see the banners behind me, promise made, promise kept. Those were there well before that Senate vote was said and done. That was the expectation, that the president would come here and boast about that, about the jobs numbers, about the trade deal he clinched. This has been a good week for Donald Trump. Certainly he feels that way, as do White House officials, Joy.
All right, Jeff Bennett, thank you very much. Appreciate you. And we are continuing to watch this scene at the Supreme Court. You can see protesters climbing the statues there. A lot of energy taking place here in Washington, D.C. We'll pick it up on the other side of the break. We'll be right back.
I used to book my hotel room on those travel sites, but there was always a catch. Like, somehow you'd wind up getting less. But now I book at Hilton.com, and I get all these great perks. I got to select my room from the floor plan.
Very nice.
I know, I'm good at picking stuff. Free Wi-Fi, laptop by the pool's a bold choice, and the price match guarantee.
How do you know all this? You like some magical Hilton fairy?
It's just here on the Hilton app. Just available to the public, so. Book at Hilton.com and get the Hilton price match guarantee if you find a low.
Right now at the Supreme Court, let's go now to our panel. Ann Garry, Washington Post White House correspondent, Shannon Pettypiece, Bloomberg News White House reporter, Josh Gerstein, Politico's senior White House reporter, and Jill Abramson, former executive editor of the New York Times. Thank you all for being here. I'm just going to go right down the row and ask each of you sort of to give me kind of your take on what we're seeing. These are remarkable protests. It strikes me, Josh, that there is just a complete binary here where you have those protesters out there who are just absolutely enraged, and then you have in Kansas Donald Trump supporters and around the country who say this is an absolute win and who are just really, this is not moving them at all, that the pain and anguish of these people, it doesn't matter. They've won. But what this is about is the court. And there are some cases that are imminent. This is not like a long-term issue. This could happen very soon, that Brett Kavanaugh could weigh in on some pretty important stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's short-term and long-term considerations both at the court and in politics. Obviously, there's a question of how this plays out in the next 4 to 5 weeks into the midterm election, but also is the GOP perhaps on the wrong side of a generational moment here, as we've seen perhaps on issues like immigration before, where the demographics get away from them. But at the Supreme Court, we've got cases that are going to be coming up very quickly. I'm looking at it as soon as this week with Justice Kavanaugh being sworn in. He may have to vote as soon as Tuesday or Wednesday on some executive power issues about whether top members of the Trump cabinet have to be deposed and testify in court about issues related to immigration and citizenship and the census. And so you saw the administration moving really quickly to get him sworn in tonight so that he'll be ready to take the bench after the holiday on Monday, Tuesday morning, begin to hear a series of criminal cases and be ready to vote. So you don't have a 4-4 deadlock.
Absolutely to Donald Trump and declared himself a partisan for him.
he, seems to align himself with the president on a lot of those issues. And as Anna said, you see an alignment with Republicans across the board with the issues they're interested in, with the Federalist Society and conservatives, and how he's managed to unify the party, even people that don't agree with the president on some issues like immigration, particularly on issues like trade and tariffs. There are a lot of Republicans who don't agree with the president and some of the policies he's undertaken. But on this issue of putting a conservative on the court, you have almost complete unanimity among Republicans in support of that and in support of getting Kavanaugh into this seat.
And Garry, your name has been invoked, so I'm gonna go to you next. I mean, the reality is, I think that there's this perception in our business, in the media, that there are multiple wings of the Republican Party. It strikes me that this week we discovered that that is not exactly true. There is one wing of the Republican Party, particularly when it comes to Supreme Court, that they intend to hold on to it for a generation or more, and that's it. That there is no other wing. There is no moderate wing.
Well, I think there are schisms, but all those schisms are willing to unite behind a few things. The most important of which is a Supreme Court nominee who is a committed Republican operative, has been for 25 years.
Sarah Huckabee Sanders today tweeted very openly, not shading it, we now have a 5-4 conservative majority. She is essentially agreeing that the Supreme Court is a partisan body, just like the Congress.
Well, I mean, we've had a 5-4 split on the court for really much of the last 15 years in many of the most important cases. What this appointment does, what this nomination, now confirmation, does, is cement that squishy middle that sometimes went the other way. And certainly many Supreme Court justices have surprised the presidents who named them once they got onto the court and turned out not to vote the way they were expected to vote. I mean, think of Souter, think of Stevens. But that seems highly unlikely, less likely in Kavanaugh's case than in any justice who's come to the court in that 15-year period that we had a middle. There is no more middle now.
Yeah, absolutely. And Shannon, I wonder if there's, in your reporting, when you talk to Republicans who probably feel very good tonight, whether or not they feel that settling even deeper into that binary, where the Republican Party is the party essentially of white Americans who are conservative, and the Democrats are the party of the people you see out there, everyone else, people of color, minorities, immigrants, LGBT people, everyone else who doesn't fall under the rubric of the people Donald Trump says he's out there working for, right? That whether or not settling into that binary and then dragging the court further into it long term might be a problem for the Republican Party, or are they just thinking we're driving forward, we own the court, it doesn't matter?
I mean, I think at this point, everyone is just trying to get as many points on the board as they can. It's one battle after another, and this, when you talk to people in the House, this was a battle. This was a battle against the Democrats. The Democrats, these people out in front of the court, these are their opponents, and it is very clear. The lines are drawn. It's shirts and skins. I know it's been that way for a while, but I mean, I think what makes this moment so striking in this partisan divide is, sure, there are protests in front of the Supreme Court when there's big controversial rulings, affirmative action, or related to abortion, but this is not a protest about an issue. This is a protest about the court itself. And yes, we would be divided on issues, and we would make disagreements about issues, but protesting and being dispirited in the court itself, I think that is a historic moment in the change of what the Supreme Court means in our entire government, in our entire structure and system of government, I don't know how we come back from that at this point.
And Jill, I'll go to you on that very question, because Bush v. Gore, I think, was the first time a lot of Americans began to think of the Supreme Court as not simply a body that interprets the law, but a body that could pick a president, and that was willing to do it, that the majority worked their will and decided who would be the next president of the United States. You now have a Supreme Court justice who has openly declared himself a partisan, who invoked the Clinton wars, who essentially declared himself to be one of the shirts versus skins openly, and to the point where he had to slightly walk it back in a Wall Street Journal op-ed. What does that mean for the esteem of that body that we're seeing being protested right now, of the court, if people believe it's just another branch of the legislative body in Congress?
I think that the past week has left an indelible stain on all of the institutions, on Congress, on the White House, and now on the Supreme Court. And that moment in the hearing when Brett Kavanaugh talked so defiantly and angrily about the fact that he thought Dr. Ford's emergence was a revenge plot on behalf of the Clintons was like nothing I've ever seen from a Supreme Court nominee. And you know, a bedrock of our system of government is the belief that the Supreme Court is not partisan, that it decides constitutional issues fairly and with some distance. And to see, you know, the bitterness right now is just, it's terrible. And you know, I thought a lot throughout the past week of I co-wrote a book, Strange Justice, about the Clarence Thomas Anita Hill hearings, and you know, those were very bitter too. But you know, the process in some ways for those hearings, as terrible as it was and as unfairly as Anita Hill was treated, was preferable to the past week, where we had kind of a sham hearing, which was designed to end in a he said, she said stalemate with only 2 witnesses, an incomplete FBI investigation, Dr. Ford not able to publicly present any of her corroborating witnesses. It was really just brute political force on behalf of the Republicans, and I don't think there was really all that much doubt about the outcome.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the reporting that there was somehow hemming and hawing on the Republican side it doesn't strike me as authentic. I think that the Republicans had all made up their minds they're all going to vote for him. And you know, the question I have now, I guess, is Donald Trump has now managed to drag in the Supreme Court. He nominated essentially himself when you saw the performance of Brett Kavanaugh. But now he's also dragged in the FBI. You heard Donald Trump doing something he has not done since he's been president, praise the FBI, because now he has caused them to essentially do his bidding, a sort of fake investigation where he can say, oh, they're doing a great job. The Justice Department's doing a great job. Everyone is now tainted.
Yeah, I mean, Donald Trump has gone through the list of American institutions one by one and criticized them on some grounds or attempted to undermine them on others, including the courts. I mean, remember, he went after Judge Curiel and sort of the rest of the judicial part of the legal and law enforcement system as a candidate. I think he sees here an opportunity to kind of bring back together, right? I mean, who knows what will happen to Jeff Sessions after the midterms, right? I mean, I think all bets are off there, but in the meantime, this is an easy one for the president.
Yeah, and Josh, he's expecting payback. I presume that the White House expects that that now Justice Kavanaugh will rule their way and will be in lockstep, or else.
Yeah, I think they're expecting, you know, Jill referred to brute force. I think on the court, it's going to be very interesting if you see it go from a court that swings back and forth with a lot of 5-4 decisions to more 6-3 decisions and seem to be leaning steadily in a conservative direction. The court will be even more viewed as just a way of extending partisan power as opposed to a neutral arbiter. Just yesterday, Justice Elena Kagan expressed concern about this during a remark she gave up at Princeton, saying without that swing vote on the court, whichever way it went, whether it was Kennedy or O'Connor or others before them, the legitimacy of the court may well be at stake.
Yeah, and I don't think Trump is above calling out and shaming on Twitter Attorney General. Sure. If someone were to rule against him, think of what he could do on Twitter. And I mean, that gets to this bigger point of how the risk of delegitimizing the court in some way, because there's a social contract where we follow the court's rulings. Yep. The court can't send in the military, they can't send in the police. Yep. We all just have to agree that we will follow their rulings. And if the president chips away at that, or the public loses trust in them, where does that go?
Yeah, everything's tainted. Everyone's been dragged in. Ann Garren, Shannon Pettypiece, Josh Gerstein, Jill Abramson. Thank you all very much. Meanwhile, the Associated Press is reporting that Kavanaugh has now officially been sworn in inside the Supreme Court in private. We'll have more on that and more from those protests at the Supreme Court when we come back.
If we expect to reach the...
I'm Ken Jacobus. I'm the owner of Good Start Packaging. We distribute environmentally friendly packaging for restaurants, and we've grown substantially. So I switched to the Spark Cash Card from Capital One. I earn unlimited 2% cash back on everything I buy. And last year...
That was the scene outside and inside Capitol Hill today, where protesters, enraged by the confirmation of Judge Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court, stormed barricades and brandished signs that read, among other things, "I believe Dr. Christine Blasey Ford." And it wasn't just in Washington. Protests erupted throughout the country, showing just how divisive this confirmation battle has been. Let's bring in NBC's Mike Vaquera, who's been covering today's protest. Mike, give us the latest on what you're seeing out there. Those protests still look pretty thick.
Yeah, well, let's get you up to date, Joy. It's somewhat filtered out here. We've seen the United States Capitol Police and Supreme Court Police move these bicycle rack cordons progressively across the front marble plaza of the Supreme Court, forcing and getting people to come down off of those steps. Everybody's back on the sidewalk now. It's pretty much a status quo ante. Really a fraction of the crowd that we saw here just a few moments ago over the course of the last hour. That remarkable scene as protesters mimicking what had really been done across the street at the Capitol on the East Plaza, swarming the steps to the Supreme Court, rushing up to the enormous brass doors and banging on them. I don't know if it was the moment that now Associate Justice Kavanaugh was being sworn in, but judging from the news accounts and the contemporaneous accounts, it was pretty close. So a remarkable scene here at the end of an extraordinary day in Washington, Joy.
Yes, indeed. Mike Vaquera, thank you very much. Really appreciate your reporting. Justice Brett Kavanaugh, Judge Brett Kavanaugh, will now become the 114th justice to serve on the Supreme Court, but questions surrounding his judicial temperament remain. The Washington Post reports that the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals was recently sent more than a dozen misconduct complaints regarding Kavanaugh to Chief Justice John Roberts. But Roberts chose not to immediately refer the complaints, many of which centered around questions of Kavanaugh's honesty and partisanship, to another court for further investigation. That means Kavanaugh will sit on the highest court in the land with yet another asterisk affixed to his name. Let's bring in former federal prosecutor Glenn Kirshner, as well as Ben Wittes, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Thank you both for being here. Glenn, I'll start with you first. So despite the fact that Brett Kavanaugh now has a lifetime seat on the court, ethics complaints can still be sent in. What do you make of the fact that on the day he's sworn in, more than a dozen such complaints came in? Actually, Merrick Garland recused himself from dealing with these complaints.
Yeah, Joy, it's not unusual for people to level complaints against sitting federal judges. I have seen the reporting where Judge Henderson of the D.C. Circuit has been forwarding these complaints up to Chief Justice Roberts in recent weeks for action. Again, the reporting says no action has been taken. I suspect that because he has now been elevated, these complaints die a slow death, and I really don't think anything will come of this ultimately.
And, you know, Ben, you know, the swearing in of a Supreme Court justice is a ceremonial affair. There's certain that are aspects of our government that are purely ceremonial. They're about sort of bringing the country together for a moment that everyone should agree is part of the peaceful transfer, right? It's part of the way that our system works. The fact that this is being done in private, Donald Trump, victory lap, saying this is all good, saying the women who are angry aren't even angry about Kavanaugh, but they're doing it privately. They're going to release a photo, but it's being sort of done in secret. What do you make of this moment?
Well, so I mean, I think normally a justice's swearing in is a private thing, and sometimes they have a sort of more public, it's not even that's not public, but right, a sort of larger investiture later on. But I don't think there's anything terribly unusual about having a private swearing in. I do think there's something highly unusual about having a private swearing in while there's really passionate protests outside, and I think that that's a reflection of you used the word asterisk in your introduction, and I think that's a reflection of the asterisks that are going to attach themselves to Brett Kavanaugh's name and face for a very long time. You know, on the one hand, the court will go through the motions of embracing him with open arms. He will get a vote. He will get a robe. He will get all the trappings of being part of this court. He will get all the adulation that comes with being a Supreme Court justice. And on the other hand, there will be this sense that people have with regard to him, and most people, you know, will not ever say it to his face, will not. He'll still be Justice Kavanaugh, but a lot of people are going to have questions whenever they see his name in news stories or on judicial opinions, and that's what you're seeing on the steps of the court right now.
You know, and the problem, Joy, is this is really a win-win for the president, but it's a lose for the country. And the reason I say it's a win-win is because, first and foremost, Judge Kavanaugh is now Justice Kavanaugh, and we have all heard that his academic position, maybe not his judicial position, but his academic position, is that a sitting president can't be criminally investigated, indicted, or tried. Essentially, the judge seems to want to make him king for a day or king for a term, and that really is not what our country is about. It's not what we were founded on. So, and then the second win is we now hear a chorus of voices going up criticizing the FBI yet again for what people are saying was an incomplete, shallow, unduly truncated investigation into Judge Kavanaugh's background. And, you know, that, I suggest, pleases the president because he loves to berate and belittle and demean the FBI. And now we hear a whole new chorus rising, criticizing the FBI, although if you follow the breadcrumbs, the complaints really should be leveled about at the White House, because they are the ones who sort of limited the FBI and what it can do.
Yeah, the president was able to put sort of a death grip around the FBI and drag them in and say, no, you helped me do this. And so it's tainted them yet again. You know, you mentioned this asterisk, and I guess the question is, there are two ways, Ben, that Brett Kavanaugh can play this. Michael Beschloss has raised the concern that this will be a justice who is very much indebted to the President of the United States, something the founders did not want to be the case with a justice. He could go in and try to take that asterisk off his name by having great equanimity, by trying not to have his decisions be overly partisan, by not trying to always be on the side of these 5-4 decisions. He could try to do what John Roberts, I think, in a lot of ways, people believe did with the Obamacare decision, and try to put a little bit of distance. Or he could come in and get revenge. He could come in and say, all my enemies will burn now that I'm a justice. Do you know the guy? Which way do you think he'll go?
Well, so I am of the perhaps rare belief that most justices, in most cases, aren't actually that strategic. And they look at cases and they, you know, influenced by whatever factors influence them, try to vote and write according to what in their lights is the right reading of the law, influenced by, you know, so I think these things largely operate subconsciously. I think if you look at Kavanaugh's history as a judge, I think it is fair to describe him as, you know, leave aside his performance last week, which is something...
Which is hard to do.
Right, but I mean, I'm talking about his 12 years as a judge, as a very careful, quite conservative judge. And he's somebody who, you know, he's extremely well prepared at oral arguments. He goes through the record very carefully. He really knows what he's doing. He works very hard. And I do hope we will return to that, as he promised in his Wall Street Journal op-ed, that Brett Kavanaugh. That said, a lot of people will not believe it. And even that Brett Kavanaugh will look like, as you describe, a sort of let them all burn conservative to a lot of liberals, because he's a really conservative guy. And so I think it's actually a no-win situation for him, largely, I want to stress, of his own making. And, you know, this is what happens when you go on the court with asterisks by your name. It's a very hard situation, and the only way for him to resolve it is to be a very rigorous, serious, independent, straight shooter over a long period of time. You know, I don't think there's a shortcut to that.
It's difficult to do that. You know, I read Omarosa Manigault's book, and she said the way that she got the Apprentice gig, she became Donald Trump. she mimicked him in every way. Brett Kavanaugh did the same thing. There's no way to unring that bell. He has now said there's a Clinton conspiracy. If a Democrat, if a case that involves Democrats comes before the court, what does it do?
And you know, he really did sound Donald Trump-esque in the hearings when he became, I think it's fair to say, a little unhinged with his conspiracy theories invoking the Clintons. And, you know, it remains to be seen now if he will pull back and use his intellect and his attention to detail and his thoroughness for good or for retribution against what he perceives to be the forces that are aligned against him. Now, Joy, some people would say, you know, he knows a radical conspiracy when he sees one because he used to be part of the Ken Starr team. I'm not accusing the Ken Starr team of that, but that was an intensely partisan endeavor, and he was on the other side of it. So we all hope that he is now going to pull back and be more judicial, be fair, be even-handed, and not seek revenge against the forces that just days ago seemed to enrage him.
Well, you know, since I have you here, before we go, I can't let you go without asking you about this case that it is all over my Twitter feed. People asking about it probably every day. Gamble versus the U.S., which is one of the cases that potentially Brett Kavanaugh could rule on. Is this case a threat in terms of could it open the door to Donald Trump being able to, let's say, pardon Paul Manafort, and then Manafort can't be tried in the state?
So I think in theory, you can make an argument that it could have that effect. The likelihood of that, in my judgment, is very near zero. The legal issue in the case, which involves this so-called dual sovereignty doctrine, is very complicated, but I am quite confident sitting here that there are not 5 votes on the Supreme Court to overturn the very old dual sovereignty doctrine, and I have no reason to think that conservative justices are more likely to want to do it than liberal justices.
Ben Whitty's doing therapy. I don't even think he knew that he was going to do that today, but for a lot of people, that was a very therapeutic statement. Glenn Kirshner, Ben Whitty, thank you both very much. Appreciate your time. We're watching the back of the Supreme Court now, where protesters are getting ready for the departure of Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. The Associated Press reports that Kavanaugh was sworn in a short time ago. Stay with us.
How did the same 3 guys get away with all that?
Well, they haven't gotten away with it. They just haven't been caught yet.
Step on it.
What did she say you do? Well, maybe, right? Before the hearings, in July, 68% of Republican voters said the November midterms were very important. After the hearings, that number jumped to 80%. But it's not just Republicans who are focused on November after the Kavanaugh fight. With me now is former Florida Congressman David Jolly and MSNBC political analyst Jason Johnson. David, I'm going to go to you first. You know, before these hearings, the media was still able to pretend there is a moderate wing of the Republican Party. I think you're the moderate wing of the Republican Party, and you ain't in the party anymore. You're not in politics. There is no moderate wing of the party. Can we now throw that notion into the dustbin of history?
Yeah, this is it. This is the closing chapter on that. And as I said last night, Susan Collins is not a moderate, Bob Corker is not a maverick, and Jeff Flake is not going to be the next Republican president of the United States. This is a fiction that one thing we have learned through the Kavanaugh process is there is no moderate wing of the Republican Party anymore.
And can I play Donald Trump? He's on Air Force One. He gives an interview with reporters. He's asked what message the Kavanaugh nomination, the wrenching Kavanaugh nomination, sends to women. And this is his answer.
Ask you what greater endeavor exists.
What is your message today to the women across this country who are feeling devastated, feeling like the message that's been sent here is that they're not being...
I don't think they are. I think actually that women... If you look at the biggest fans, and I can tell you that the people that spoke to me most, really in the strongest of terms, in his favor, were women. Women were outraged at what happened to Brett Kavanaugh. Outraged.
If the producer could just bring, thank you, put back up those protests. If you guys can reel up some of the tape from before, from earlier today. Jason, Donald Trump says that the women who were out there, people who are trying to literally storm the Supreme Court, don't exist, that you didn't see them. This is classic autocrat behavior. You didn't see them, and if you did, they were protesting for me, not against me.
Yeah, what are you, maybe you're going to believe what I say, or you're going to believe your own eyes, right? He's like every other abusive man out there. Women don't exist. Their opinions don't exist. And here's or they're led by some evil anti-Semitic cabal by George Soros. I mean, that's the problem with how this has happened is the way in which the people who have legitimate concerns about Kavanaugh have been absolutely demonized by the Republican Party. And now you put someone on the court who has made it abundantly clear through his speech that he's basically going to take revenge on any and everybody who he feels wronged him in this process. So this whole thing is damaging, and electorally, everyone has to, basically, it's not that this midterm election is important. People are going to have to vote now because who knows what could happen to voting rights with a Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court, given some of the issues that they're going to be facing in the next year and a half.
Yeah, if Justice Roberts is the moderate we have to count on, well, that's the guy who gutted the Voting Rights Act. I'm not sure people should feel that comfortable. David Jolly, you now have Republicans essentially down to essentially white Americans, white conservative men and women. They are pulling they're making that tent smaller and smaller and smaller. But in their mind, it's worth it. Can the Republican Party survive long term if they just go down to the hard-bitten people who feel incredibly enraged about President Obama ever being president and who want Donald Trump to burn it all to the ground?
No, they can't. Once again, let's revisit that Republicans have only won the popular vote for the presidency one time in the last 28 years. They are losing the electoral and the demographic trend of the country, and instead of trying to address the gap and why they are losing it, they are doubling down on the few voters they have. Look, we've been speaking about voter intensity, GOP intensity in the last week, and there's something very important to understand about this, and I think Republicans are miscalculating this as well. The spike in GOP intensity means that Republican voters are more excited to support Republican candidates. It does not mean that the Republican Party is attracting more voters. The voters they are going to lose through this Kavanaugh process are the women you just described, who say, I just saw a United States Senate largely of white male Republican men say, we don't believe women. And in fact, they took the message further and said, not only do we not believe the women, but this has become a war on young, privileged white men. That message doesn't sell in most communities.
Yeah, can we just put that picture back up of the swearing in? If we could put that back up. Because, Jason, what Republicans are essentially arguing is that getting that picture is worth it, right? Yeah. That for the Republican base, that's it. That's all they care about is getting that. And that no matter what women had to go through, too bad, so sad, you were abused, so what?
Yeah, well, it doesn't matter. And what's interesting, I found this in a lot of the responses from the members of Congress and the senators who are like, who could bring themselves to say, I believe Dr. Ford. Yeah. I think something happened to her.
The little lady just got it wrong.
Yeah, but she just got confused as to which one of these men attacked her, which I think is disgusting. But here's the thing, but it is worth it. Look, they've got a Supreme Court justice who's going to be there for 8,000 years. He's going to be like, you know, people who are angry and mean like that. Those are the people who never die. They stay around forever. The issue is going to be whether or not any of this has an electoral impact. And the problem is, like I said before, you know, former Congressman Jolly mentioned it. The Republicans are excited about their own people. But you look at Pennsylvania, New Mexico, Michigan, Minnesota, Iowa, all of these swing states that Trump won are about to get Democratic governors. That means no voter suppression in 2020. That means a lot of these states are going to go blue no matter who the Democrats won against Trump in 2020.
Yeah, minority rule works for a little while. Very quickly, wrapping it up, David Jolly, can the Republicans survive on minority rule long term?
No, because the breaking moment culturally here is this. The American people have seen the Republican majority say we don't believe women and this is a war on white young men. When what they want to hear Republicans say is teach your kids that no means no and sexually assaulting women is wrong.
Yeah, we should hope that that would be the message. David Jolly, Jason Johnson, thank you for bringing it in right on time. That is our show for today. Be sure to join me for AM Joy tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Eastern. Ali Velshi picks up our special coverage of the Kavanaugh confirmation right after this short break.
The midterms by the numbers. 23.
For Democrats to take the House, they need to flip 23 seats.
10.
There are
to my attention that some have lately called me a collaborator, as if such a term were shameful. I ask you,
Down in 2000.
Yes.
Republicans liked the rules. They liked the fact that the time was up, that there were certain rules. The Democrats wanted everyone's intention to vote, to count.
Yeah.
And here again, the Democrats want all the voices to be heard. They want to have all the witnesses. Well, they want them recruited. Go out and find the witnesses. Don't just say there's a one-week time limit. Find the people that said they wanted to speak. In fact, let the people who called in on the tip line at the FBI, let them speak. But let's go back right now to more of this.
As a reminder to our guests in the galleries, expressions of approval or disapproval are not permitted in the Senate gallery. Are there any senators in the chamber who wish to vote or change a vote? If not, on this vote, the ayes are 50, the nays are 48. The nomination of Brett M. Kavanaugh of Maryland to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States is confirmed.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I ask consent the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Without objection.
I suggest the absence of quorum.
Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the gallery. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
You know, when you listen to the vice president there as president of the Senate, you often notice there's a certain pause before he speaks. That's because he's being prompted. Nothing wrong with that. The parliamentarians do that for a living. They're whispering from off camera there to the one in the chair, telling them what to say next. In fact, it's literal. It's word for word what they're supposed to say. Anyway, joining right now is Joy Reid, of course, from AM Joy, Reverend Al Sharpton, host of Politics Nation, and Elise Jordan, MSNBC political analyst. So in that order, let's go to the Reverend first. We don't have the Reverend here. Let's go to Joy again. Joy, you're thinking about this. I know you have passions on this subject, and they are appropriately placed. So who's going to win the, as they say in baseball, the bounce of the ball? Because I think both sides are claiming new energy as a result of this whole episode.
Well, talking with, Republican strategist friends of mine, they essentially said that the fight over Kavanaugh energized the Republican base, particularly white men and college-educated white women who saw in Kavanaugh their son who's in a fraternity, et cetera, and were energized for the Republicans. It's not sure that can last the next 30 days, but the anger, the rage, just the pure, unadulterated anger and rage of women, of non-Republican women, I think is something that can carry over. And I was struck that Mitch McConnell said, we all know the events of recent weeks have strained the Senate's comity and fanned the flames of partisan discord. Well, my God, who's done that more than Mitch McConnell? Mitch McConnell broke the Senate and then urged people to come back from the darkness. He brought the darkness. Mitch McConnell has decided that the Senate is the place where Republicans have absolute power, where Democrats have none, where they rule women and people of color on behalf of Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell's own aims. This man brought the darkness. He succeeded in bringing the darkness, and now he claims he's putting a man of the highest character and superlative qualifications on the court. The majority of Americans disagree with that. They feel that Kavanaugh has been imposed, forced on the majority of Americans by a minority who wants to rule from the past. Mitch McConnell wants to rule from decades ago, that he is imposing order, as he sees it, on the majority of Americans. I have a feeling that the outrage over that will last longer than the sugar high of having gotten their man.
Well, let me go to Elise Jordan, because as we know in the Constitution, the Senate is not basically elected based on majority rule by the country. It's certainly not popular rule. States like Montana, North Dakota, those states can elect a very conservative senator for forever and not have to deal with the national passions at all.
Well, and Chris, I think where, speaking of the so-called Kavanaugh bump that Republican strategists I've been speaking with are excited about, where you're really going to see impact are in these red states where you had Democratic candidates who were in tight races with Republicans. Specifically, look at the example of Tennessee and how former Governor Phil Bredesen's numbers have suffered since the start of this confirmation process. So in the suburban districts that are, the House races that are under tough contest, you might not necessarily see any movement, but I'm looking at Senate races and how that balance of power is going to probably be solidified again by Republicans.
Well, don't stop there. Who do you think is going to win now, or has a better chance of winning now than they had, say, 2 weeks ago?
I think Claire McCaskill has a really tough race. I think that Marsha Blackburn, this is just a godsend for her. I think that Phil Bredesen was in line to win that race, but this plays very differently in Tennessee than it does in coastal America. But Florida, speaking of Florida, I think that Bill Nelson actually, his chances are a little bit strengthened there, and you're looking at how that race has turned a bit since the primaries and also the governor's race and Andrew Gillum's candidacy over Ron DeStefanis.
That's very shrewd. I accept that. I think you got some smart touting there. I think it looks good. And Nelson has some amazing life in him coming back there. I've always thought Blackburn was a stronger candidate. I don't think people are really thrilled about bringing back somebody from the past.
After the party, the Hamiltonian party lost, the Federalists lost all power. They still...
Ford had testified she was 100% confident it was Kavanaugh, and the president also says he's 100% certain that Christine Blasey Ford named the wrong person when she accused Kavanaugh. So the president already speaking out about this major victory. Of course, he campaigned on a promise to put conservatives on the high court, and so far, Chris, he's had 2 new Supreme Court justices that he has named, of course, Judge Neil Gorsuch, and now who will soon become Justice Brett Kavanaugh. He's going to be sworn in a little bit later on today. Now, President Trump also tweeting about this big win moments ago, saying, "I applaud and congratulate the U.S. Senate for confirming our great nominee, Judge Brett Kavanaugh, to the United States Supreme Court. Later today, I will sign his commission of appointment, and he will be officially sworn in." Very exciting. He's also talking about this to the Washington Post, Chris, if this gives you a sense of just how emboldened he is feeling at this hour, saying that Lisa Murkowski, the senator from Alaska who voted no, will effectively never live this down. He has said that she will never recover from voting no. So speaking extensively about this big victory, Chris, we've been spending so much time talking about the president's tone. He was at first very measured when he started talking about this controversy several days ago, saying he wanted to hear from Dr. Ford, and then having heard from her, saying that she was credible. And then his tone changed out on the campaign trail. He started to go after her, to mock her. That was something that energized his crowds, and it has frankly energized the Republican base. If you take a look at the polls, that enthusiasm gap, we saw Democrats really leading in the enthusiasm gap. Well, it's narrowed quite a bit. And then, of course, that brings us to the question that you've been debating. Will that Republican enthusiasm continue on through Election Day? We know one thing. We know that President Trump's going to be campaigning on this. Again, he's going to be taking a big victory lap in Kansas. And, Chris, he has a number of campaign events ahead between now and Election Day. So you can bet this is something he's going to mention each and every time he steps in front of the podium, Chris.
Well, let's do a little analysis here, Kristen. Well, it seems to me that Trump has certain powers which are extraordinary in red states. I mean, if 9 out of 10 Republicans support him right down the line on every issue, Republican states are going to be more likely to vote for the Republican candidate if he says so. So he has a lot of swag in North Dakota. He may have more swag perhaps in Missouri than he has, say, in the East somewhere. But in the end, he is picking his targets. As you look at his travel schedule, he's not going to Connecticut. He's not going to New York. He's not going to Massachusetts. So he is sort of recognizing his limitations in where he chooses to go.
Well, I think you're right about that, Chris, and that underscores a central question, which is, will his very sharp rhetoric that we have seen in recent days, including as it relates to Dr. Ford, will that backfire when it comes to those all-important suburban women voters?
Right.
Will they be on board with that type of language, particularly in those races that may be in red states, but in those races that are razor tight? What will that mean for the margins? Of course, he's fighting to not only hold on to the Senate, but the House, and the House looking very difficult. I was with him in Minnesota earlier this week. Of course, he lost Minnesota, but I can tell you where we were, the crowd was incredibly energized and the stadium was packed. So he's still drawing those very big crowds, Chris, even when he isn't in the reddest of red places. But the question again becomes, will some of that sharp rhetoric in any way backfire for this president heading into the midterms, Chris?
You know, Kristen, I used to think we lived in one country. I don't think we live in one country anymore. You can't talk about how America feels anymore. There's two different countries right next to each other, divided right now very clearly. Thank you so much for joining us from the White House, Kristen Welker. Let's bring in Betsy Woodruff, politics reporter for the Daily Beast, Eleanor Cliff, Washington correspondent for the Daily Beast as well, and Charlie Savage, Washington correspondent for the New York Times. I want to do a little division here, and I don't think we know yet, but Eleanor, you and I have been through these. I just tell you, I just ask you, how do you decide who's going to have the most coming up? They're both leaving the starting gate right now. The Democrats and Republicans, that 1 month exactly till Election Day. Who's coming off the fastest off the blocks?
It's male rage versus female rage. There are more women in this country than there are men. More women registered to vote. We tend to go to the polls more regularly than men. But I think Democrats are cowed by Trump's ability to tap into this grievance that white men feel. And I think one poll has shown...
It's not like white guys, it's skinny white guys who look nervous. It's like, I don't know what.
Well, I don't know what it has to do with weight exactly.
Well, who's that guy that used to be on Andy Griffith, the nervous deputy sheriff? I mean, it's just like, that's like everybody. Barney Fife, it seems like the Barney Fife party.
Heroes, I don't know. I don't think there are a lot of role models necessarily to tap into this. But the president is clearly rewriting how this nomination unfolded and is attributing it to a smear job by Democrats. And he's found, apparently, all these women who are now aggrieved over how Brett Kavanaugh has been treated.
Where are they?
And he's trying to appeal to women like me who have sons. I have 3 sons. And the message is, you know, if Brett Kavanaugh is vulnerable, your sons are vulnerable, your husband's vulnerable. Women are going to be coming out making all of these fraudulent accusations. It's a bizarre trap to draw, but I think a lot of people are falling into it who tend to listen to this president anyway. But you know, I think that's today and tomorrow. But
which of these accusations hasn't been true? I mean, Stormy Daniels, he paid her off. He paid off Andy McDougal.
Totally.
I mean, these are all real cases. This is not. There's nobody out there making up fortune cookie cases.
The fact checks don't necessarily stop Trump.
Yeah.
The context here that's important to remember, though, is that women certainly aren't a monolith when it comes to these hot-button issues. Remember, the majority of white women voted for Donald Trump, even in the wake of the Access Hollywood tape. That's right, it's significant. Even in the wake of that tape where he boasted about activity that constitutes sexual assault. And in the same way, many conservative, evangelical Christian women are going to find a lot to like in Kavanaugh. Whether or not that involves some sort of cognitive dissonance when it comes to these allegations is you know, above my pay grade to assess. But it's important to remember that this isn't just a battle of the sexes.
I have been listening around my world, including my family, and a lot of it's class. This upper middle class crowd around Kavanaugh is protective.
That's true.
They are.
Especially the Washington community. Trump campaigned on draining the swamp, but you won't find someone who is more a creature of Washington than Judge, soon-to-be Justice Kavanaugh. Has spent much of his career here, grew up here, was one of the most powerful figures of American politics, bar none, before he became confirmed to be a justice on the Supreme Court. So very much is important to remember, you know, your point here is absolutely right. It is a class question as well as a gender question.
Although you have to remember, Christy Blasey Ford was also a member of the same class, the same Washington community. And I think we can't discount how much this conversation changed when Avenatti came in with the Sweatnick allegations of druggy gang rape stuff that seems to have been much less taken as credible than the original allegations. I think that if you listen to Susan Collins' speech yesterday and if you listen to the rhetoric on the right and coming out of the White House, they seized upon this much less credible looking set of allegations to taint the original ones by association. And this is the thing that, hey, mothers, your daughters are going, your sons, I'm sorry, are going to be hit with fraudulent allegations where suddenly they were drugging and gang raping everyone, and everyone's like, what is that? Avenatti did a huge favor to the Trump White House by coming out and backing this and putting so much prominence around it.
I still want to go back to something. Ellen and I have been through this. We sort of get in our heads sort of a scoring system. You know, there's boundaries in football. You know, there's a goal line here, and it's 100 yards. You know, there's certain things you think were going to work. When a president attacks a woman who's a victim, like he did this past week, I mean, just attacked her, made fun of her with that wonderful ability to ridicule he has. It's not nice, but it's one. He knows exactly how to ridicule something. She can't remember, just had one beer. Can't remember this, doesn't know how she got that, doesn't know how she got it, but just had one beer. This ridicule worked. According to everybody studying this. What happened here? Why do people like that?
I don't know that necessarily.
Well, they all say that was the pivot point.
That was a pivot point. Well, so was Lindsey Graham was a pivot point. I mean, you can find a couple of pivot points in this where the OG, we're really hearing that victims should be heard. I mean, they were all on that message, but when they began to see that Kavanaugh needed to fight back, everybody got off that original message. But, you know, Trump did it all. But, you know, when he mocked the reporter who was disabled, you know, that has stuck in people's minds, and I don't think that was a positive thing, and I think his mocking of Blasey Ford is going to stick in a lot of women's minds as well. But I take Betsy's point that a lot of women are saying, okay, he did this, but I'm getting my Supreme Court justice, and I'm pro-life, and that's important to me.
Well, that explains Pennsylvania, I think, last time in 16. I think my brother told me a lot of people, he said he never saw so many people in walkers. Older Catholics had shown up to vote, and they knew Trump's lifestyle. They weren't kidding. He was Frank Sinatra running for president. They knew who he was. They still wanted that vote. And by the way, they got 2 of them now.
Yeah, but history
2 out of 9.
History's going to note that this confirmation took place with sexual assault allegations against the nominee, and a president who nominated him, who had 20 women come forward.
Are we going to hear it? What's the bet here?
About it.
You're all reporters. What's the bet? Are we going to have people come out of the woodwork next week, the week after, writing books saying, well, I was there. I was there with Ramirez. I was there with Ford. Do you think this is going to end, Betsy?
I would be surprised if that were to happen, only because if you're in a situation where you were a witness to this kind of activity and you go public after the confirmation, you have nothing to gain politically. You're not contributing at all to the
Well, you're not hurting anybody.
But you're putting yourself in the public limelight, and you're going to face all the inevitable death threats and harassment that anyone who comes forward with these allegations faces. So if I were
forever hold your peace.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, well,
I know they moved up Clarence Thomas's swearing in because they were afraid more women were going to come forward. Now, I'm sure that this whole thing has been a big hurry for fear that there were more women out there.
It's going to be sworn in today, it turns out. Coming up, protesters out in force at the Supreme Court right now. We'll take you out there. They're not going away. We'll be right back.
Here we go. Discover. I like your card, but I'm absolutely not paying an annual fee.
Discover has no annual fees.
Really? Yeah.
We just don't believe in them.
Oh, nice. You would not believe how long I've been rehearsing that.
No. Now arrests up there on Capitol Hill and at the Supreme Court today as people protest the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. NBC's Mike Vaccaro covering the protests in Washington today. Mike, it's great to have you here today, have you back on this kind of front where maybe you brought this trouble with you, but it's great. But I think it's good for Americans to see their fellow citizens out showing their passion. You have a right to petition Congress in the First Amendment to the Constitution. What they're doing right now is their right, and I'm glad they're doing it.
It's an extraordinary situation, Chris. You and I have been covering the Capitol for a long time, and I have never seen a situation like I saw earlier today when it was almost an impromptu march. They had sort of planned it beforehand. I was privy to a little bit of that, watching them plan here on the east lawn of the Capitol, but they marched over and eluded the Capitol Police, who were trying to converge very quickly, and sort of took over the east steps of the Capitol. Capitol Police now revealing that 150 people were arrested during that civic action. Generally, they're not in jail very long. long. As a matter of fact, some of them are already out. But we're here on the east front of the Capitol, and many people have gathered to either cheer or jeer senators as they emerge from the Capitol. Chris Coons, of course, the Democrat, obviously depends on how they voted. This crowd obviously anti-Kavanaugh. Chris Coons cheered. Ted Cruz came out. He was jeered, and he waved to the crowd as if in a mocking way, and it really points to the subject you were having, the discussion you were having earlier, or whether or not Republicans feel like ultimately this is a politically something that fires up their base 1 month out from the election. I got to tell you, for the people that I've been talking to, the protesters that I've been reporting on over the course of last week, they don't really care that there is a backlash. They're not so concerned that there's a backlash or a purported backlash against what they've been doing and some of the tactics that they've been using. Yes, Ted Cruz and Mitch McConnell, they are politicians. They need a foil. Both sides need a foil, something to campaign against. And we've heard the president and Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham use a very harsh language to try to portray some of these protesters as being sort of out of line. They like to cast that contrast. But, you know, again, the people who are here in the halls, who have been in the halls the last couple of weeks, some 300 of them arrested Thursday in the Hart Atrium. Their complaint is that these members of Congress are inaccessible. They're not having town halls. They're not being responsive to their concerns. And so you called it an explosion of democracy. Hey, that works. They've been speaking truth to power in their opinion. It's something that they've undertaken. Question is, we're 1 month out. What's the staying power? 2 years out, what's the staying power? Chris?
Well, Mike, I've been there myself back in the 60s in the anti-war movement. I've been to demonstrations. I went to one at the Pentagon. So I know what they're like, and I do think they make a difference. It takes a while, but the voices are heard. Thank you so much. Mike Vaquera from the steps of the U.S. Capitol. With me right now for our special coverage, the Reverend Al Sharpton from Politics Nation and MSNBC political analyst Elise Jordan. Thank you both. Reverend Al, thank you for joining us. Give us a sense of your mood right now. You're going to be preaching tomorrow. You'll be back on the air tomorrow. What's the, is there a complicated message here? Is it one of outrage, or is it one of self-satisfaction and outrage? I
think it is outrage, but it is towards sustained indignation. You can't just get angry and not drive that anger in a constructive way to vote to protect your interests. I think this is not just about one singular issue. This is about the last 50 or 60 years where this country became, at least by law, more inclusive of gender, of race, of LGBTQ. And we're talking about now the real possibility of a Supreme Court reversing many of those things. I think that's why the president came out and why McConnell came out, starting to go for the political fight, attacking certain senators and attacking certain interests that they claim were behind this, rather than deal with what this will mean in the Supreme Court. We have, Chris, in the pipeline, cases that will determine the future of voting rights, of the Affordable Care Act, of affirmative action, many things that are in the pipeline to go before this court. And the sermons I think people have to preach tomorrow is everything that we have known for the last half century is at stake now, which is why we've got to vote. And for the first time in a long time, if ever, we see one party controlling the three branches of government. The right wing of the Republican Party, more accurately the Trump wing, controls the executive branch, legislative branch, and judicial branch. That is not what the Founding Fathers, though we were not part of it, the Founding Fathers said that we need checks and balances. There are no checks and balances. They've got to be checked in November.
Elise, why do the conservatives want the Supreme Court so much?
Why wouldn't you, Chris? Because it's power. It is gotten outsized power in the past couple of decades because Congress fails to do their job. And so many major policy decisions have been outsourced to the court. And by taking a more proactive stance in grooming a pipeline of potential Supreme Court justices, we've seen where conservatives have been quite successful in grooming and cultivating good candidates throughout the process so that they today they were able to realize that their long-held goal of a more conservative Supreme Court.
I ask that because I do have some experience anecdotally in watching people showing up for Trump who have nothing but contempt for his lifestyle, his marital history, if you will, the whole thing, the whole works of who Donald Trump is, and yet are willing to put their only vote, the only vote they have, on the line for him in places like Pennsylvania. And I wonder if that is unique to the conservative side of the argument. It just seems Democrats wouldn't do that. They just wouldn't give everything for the Supreme Court.
Well, during the 2016 election, there were plenty of evangelical voters who ended up voting reluctantly for Trump, and they told me that their vote was specifically because of Roe versus Wade, and they felt that Donald Trump would appoint justices who were more likely to overturn Roe versus Wade, and so that was why they made their choice over Hillary Clinton. But this is an issue that will continue to always be important with conservatives, and you can see where their voting choices are influenced by maintaining control of the Supreme Court.
Well, President Trump will soon be taking a public victory lap over the Kavanaugh confirmation at a campaign rally out in Kansas. We're going to take you there live. In fact, here we are.
I can't believe it. That everything sticks to Stephon Diggs' hands? No, I can't believe how easy it was to save hundreds of dollars on the car insurance with Geico. Cool, huh?
Yeah. After the party, the Hamiltonian party lost, the Federalists lost all power, they still had the court. They still had Marshall running the court. And I think you're right. It's now time, if there's going to be a time that the liberal part of the country, the left, if you will, gets as excited about court appointments as the right has been for our history. Let's bring in NBC's Kristen Walker at the White House. There's some new comments, apparently. I can tell you got some new stuff from the president. What is it, Kristen?
We got some new comments from the president, Chris, who's traveling aboard Air Force One to Kansas right now, where he will take a big victory lap this evening. That victory lap, though, Chris, already starting. Let me read you the comments, what he's telling reporters at this hour. He says of the confirmation, we're very honored that he was able to withstand this horrible, horrible attack by the Democrats. So again, taking direct aim at Democrats for holding up his confirmation. He also says women were outraged at what happened to Brett Kavanaugh, outraged, echoing the comments by some Republican women, including Susan Collins, who said that she believes it wasn't Brett Kavanaugh who sexually assaulted Christine Blasey Ford, despite the fact that Ford had testified she was 100% confident it was Kavanaugh. And the president also says he's 100% certain that Christine Blasey Ford named the wrong person when she accused Kavanaugh. So the president already speaking out about this major victory. Of course, he campaigned on a promise to put conservatives on the high court. And so far, Chris, he's had 2 new Supreme Court justices that he has named, of course, Judge Neil Gorsuch, and now who will soon become Justice Brett Kavanaugh. He's going to be sworn in a little bit later on today. Now, President Trump also tweeting about this big win moments ago, saying, I applaud and congratulate the U.S. Senate for confirming our great nominee, Judge Brett Kavanaugh, to the United States Supreme Court. Later today, I will sign his commission of appointment, and he will be officially sworn in. Very exciting. He's also talking about this to the Washington Post, Chris, if this gives you a sense of just how emboldened he is feeling at this hour, saying that Lisa Murkowski, the senator from Alaska who voted no, will effectively never live this down. He has said that she will never recover from voting no. So speaking extensively about this big victory, Chris, we've been spending so much time talking about the president's tone. He was at first very measured when he started talking about this controversy several days ago, saying he wanted to hear from Dr. Ford, and then having heard from her, saying that she was credible. And then his tone changed out on the campaign trail. He started to go after her, to mock her. That was something that energized his crowds, and it has frankly energized the Republican base. If you take a look at the polls, that enthusiasm gap, we saw Democrats really leading in the enthusiasm gap. Well, it's narrowed quite a bit. And then, of course, that brings us to the question that you've been debating. Will that Republican enthusiasm continue on through election Election Day. We know one thing. We know that President Trump's going to be campaigning on this. Again, he's going to be taking a big victory lap in Kansas. And, Chris, he has a number of campaign events ahead between now and Election Day. So you can bet this is something he's going to mention each and every time he steps in front of the podium. Chris.
Well, let's do a little analysis here, Kristen. Well, it seems to me that Trump has certain powers which are extraordinary in red states. I mean, if 9 out of 10 Republicans support him right down the line on every issue, Republican states are going to be more likely to vote for the Republican candidate if he says so. So he has a lot of swag in North Dakota. He may have more swag perhaps in Missouri than he has, say, in the East somewhere. But in the end, he is picking his targets. As you look at his travel schedule, he's not going to Connecticut. He's not going to New York. He's not going to Massachusetts. So he is sort of recognizing his limitations in where he chooses to go.
Well, I think you're right about that, Chris, and that underscores a central question, which is, will his very sharp rhetoric that we have seen in recent days, including as it relates to Dr. Ford, will that backfire when it comes to those all-important suburban women voters?
Right.
Will they be on board with that type of language, particularly in those races that may be in red states, but in those races that are razor tight? What will that mean for the margins? Of course, he's fighting to not only hold on to the Senate, but the House, and the House looking very difficult. I was with him in Minnesota earlier this week. Of course, he lost Minnesota, but I can tell you where we were, the crowd was incredibly energized and the stadium was packed. So he's still drawing those very big crowds, Chris, even when he isn't in the reddest of red places. But the question again becomes, will some of that sharp rhetoric in any way backfire for this president heading into the midterms, Chris?
You know, Kristen, I used to think we lived in one country. I don't think we live in one country anymore. You can't talk about how America feels anymore. There's
all in. Republicans have the votes to confirm Brett Kavanaugh.
We're going to plow right through it.
Tonight, the backlash to Manchin, Flake, and Collins with Senator Mazie Hirono.
Then I made my decision, and I gave my reasons for my decision. Ours went out, and we want to make sure.
The lasting damage to the Supreme Court with Sherilyn Ifill and Nancy Gertner.
This was not a search for the truth.
The political fallout for November and beyond with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and how we move forward after a nightmare week for survivors.
Indelible in the hippocampus is the laughter.
But All In starts right now.
Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Well, in the words of Mitch McConnell, they plowed right through, ignoring testimony from Christine Blasey Ford that even they themselves said was credible and compelling, as well as evidence that Brett Kavanaugh repeatedly lied under oath. Senators from the party of Trump today moved to give Kavanaugh a lifetime appointment on the Supreme Court. The final vote is expected tomorrow, but the fight appears to be over. One Republican, Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, voted no today, a decision she said she made at the last minute after spending yesterday meeting with sexual assault survivors. The Democrat Joe Manchin, as well as Republicans Jeff Flake and Susan Collins, all said they were voting yes. Collins gave a nearly 45-minute speech to announce her decision, although it was clear from the first 30 seconds she had been a yes all along. In her speech, she misrepresented some facts, criticized protesters, and like almost every other Republican said she wanted you to know she believed Dr. Blasey Ford, although, you know, not really. The question now is what Republicans have unleashed. Protesters swarmed the Capitol again today, many of them trying to get senators to listen to harrowing stories of sexual assault. They chanted shame at Joe Manchin as he defended his decision to vote yes, and cried as they listened to Susan Collins announce her decision. A fund to support whoever runs against Collins in 2020, if she backed Kavanaugh, flew past the $2 million mark as Collins spoke. The man we elected president, of course, said the women telling their stories of surviving sexual assault are all lying, calling them paid professionals paid for by George Soros, which, again, is the mainstream view of Susan Collins' Republican Party.
Do you believe George Soros is behind all of this, paying these people to get you and your colleagues in elevators or wherever they can get in your face?
I tend to believe it. I believe it fits in his attack mode that he has.
There is no evidence for that, we should note. Chuck Grassley, Susan Collins, Donald Trump, Joe Manchin all have the same message today. Either we don't believe you or we believe you and we don't care. The midterm elections are now 32 days away, and the stakes could not be more crystal clear. With me now, Senator Mazie Hirono of Hawaii, a Democrat on the Senate Judiciary Committee. She voted no today. Your reaction, Senator, what happened today?
Well, I was particularly disappointed with Senator Collins because she is a person who has said that she's very concerned about women's reproductive rights. And she cited to a case which she didn't name, where Judge Kavanaugh at bottom said, Catholic Church, you folks, you know, can deny contraceptive coverage to your employees because it is too much for you to have to file a 2-page form. And interestingly, she did not cite to a much more relevant case in which Judge Kavanaugh was the dissenter. It's the Garza case wherein he said, the bottom line, a 17-year-old girl who should have been able to have an abortion, he dissented from that right. That is a much more relevant case, and for any of us at this point to think that any of these nominees who come before us and say Roe v. Wade is settled law, that is just, you know, they don't have to overturn Roe v. Wade. States like Texas, Louisiana are very busy adopting all kinds of laws that would limit a woman's right to choose, and these cases, these laws will be challenged, go up to the Supreme Court, and I fully expect Judge Kavanaugh to side with these limiting laws. So you don't have to repeal Roe v. Wade. You can pretty much make it a nullity. So I was very disappointed with Senator Collins, but I'm proud of the fact that my other friends, Joe Donnelly and Claire McCaskill, clearly Lisa Murkowski and Heidi Heitkamp, voted their conscience and listened to their people and to the cries of the women, who, by the way, to think that George Soros hired thousands of women, my God, what is this, some kind of a conspiracy dream that they have? Well, give me a break.
Let me ask you this. A few weeks ago, a sort of prominent conservative legal thinker, think tank guy named Ed Whelan, had this entire Twitter thread where he appeared to, in a wildly defamatory fashion, point the finger at another person for the assault that Dr. Ford said she suffered. He then had to take it down. He had to apologize. He was ridiculed. It was embarrassing. It was terrible. Everyone agreed that was terrible. 2 weeks later, that appears to be the mainstream position of the Republican caucus, including Susan Collins and others, that someone assaulted Dr. Ford. She just doesn't correctly remember who it was. What do you think of that?
I think that that is telegraphing to America that the Republicans can't deal fairly with the issue of sexual assault and the survivors. And they are saying to Dr. Ford and all those in her shoes, of which there are thousands, that one, we don't want to hear from you. Two, if we have to hear from you, we're going to rig it so that there's no FBI investigation, and we're not going to call any other witnesses. This is what we're telegraphing, the Republicans are telegraphing, and I think it's a terrible message. And, you know, when President Trump and his son say things such as, oh, the men in this country should be really afraid, you know, this is what men who are threatened say. You know, what are they afraid of? If they treat women with respect, do not sexually harass them or my goodness, engage in sexual assault, they have nothing to worry about, because guess what? All you men out there, we women don't sit around trying to cook up these kinds of stories about you. This is a tremendous fear and mistrust of women that we have to overcome in this country. But sadly, that is not what the Senate did, the Senate Republicans did, in dealing with Dr. Ford's credible reports.
Senator Chuck Grassley, who's the chair of the committee on which you serve, was asked why there weren't more women on that committee, I think particularly from the Republican side. He said the committee is a lot of work. You got to remember, we got an executive meeting every Thursday. Maybe they don't want to do it. Later, his spokesperson, somewhat frenetically and with great panic, tried to walk that back. What do you think of that?
I think that is one of the more ridiculous things that Chuck Grassley has said, and it just goes to show, is this where the Republicans are, that they think that women can't engage in hard work, that we can't do more than, you know, cook and clean and all of that? Are you kidding? We women have had to do all this stuff for eons, and for him to say what he did just goes to show how out of touch and sadly clueless he is.
How do you think, finally, he has conducted this entire affair?
This entire hearing for Judge Kavanaugh has not been normal because, for one thing, they're just rushing this like crazy. They wanted to get him on the court by the October term so that he could be the fifth vote on so many issues that are going to affect all of our lives. But that was all a rush job. Two, it's not normal that we wouldn't have access to the thousands and thousands of documents that we normally would have access to regarding Judge Kavanaugh. Three, when we had a hearing, you know, of a credible report by Dr. Kavanaugh, Dr. Ford, that not to call any other witnesses, not to have an FBI investigation, nothing normal about how this whole process was handled. You know, for the life of me, we are telegraphing something very, very damaging about the Senate, the Judiciary Committee's operations, and of course, should Judge Kavanaugh get on the Supreme Court, which is where he's heading, we're going to send yet another person with a huge cloud over his head to the Supreme Court. It's bad enough we sent one person like that, and I think it affects the credibility of the Supreme Court. And let's not forget that he just ripped the veil of objectivity by showing us what a partisan operative he's going to be, and he is.
Senator Mazie Hirono, thank you for being with me.
Sure.
Joining me now, NBC News national political reporter Heidi Presbala, who is out tonight with an exclusive report detailing how Kavanaugh's Yale classmates were ignored by the FBI in its latest investigation, and includes some sort of remarkable texts that you acquired. Talk me through the story, Heidi.
Right, Chris. Well, this just shows how the issue of whether this was a complete investigation is going to linger for a long time. Here you have basically electronic information from people who wanted to come forward to the FBI, wanted to come forward to the Judiciary Committee, being turned away. And these text messages that NBC obtained exclusively show here that Brett Kavanaugh was actually advising one of those people who Debbie Ramirez identified as an eyewitness. And if you, I think you have the text message there, but if you put it up, you will see that this eyewitness, who we've confirmed was one of the people that Debbie Ramirez identified as in the room, is lashing out and saying, how could you tell anybody that I was talking to Brett Kavanaugh in advance of this New Yorker story? And so what does this tell us, Chris? It just tells us that at this moment, when we don't even know if the eyewitnesses that Debbie Ramirez identified in this case were interviewed, this would have been critical information to have in front of the FBI in order to question those people, and that this is something that is going to continue to haunt this nomination.
Well, let me just to put up those texts again. So part of the story here is just that an intermediary here, right? This is a person who's texting with the person that you have the text from, or you from whom you acquired them, or I don't know if you got them from them, but they're the recipient. Don't effing tell people Brett got in touch with me. This is someone panicking because he had communicated that in advance of the New Yorker story being published, Kavanaugh had reached out attempting to tamp down the story. Do I have that right?
You have that exactly right. And that is just one text, Chris. If you go to NBCnews.com, you will see that there is a theme, a thread that runs through these texts that NBC obtained from two different women, former classmates. Some of them, one of them, for instance, is a misfire. But what the thread that you see that runs through it is questions from these women who got these, were the recipients of these text messages, as to whether there was a, quote, anticipatory narrative about Debbie Ramirez and her story coming out as early as July. That was months in advance of when the story about Debbie came out. One part, for instance, that's really telling is that days after Christine Blasey Ford contacted the Washington Post anonymously, she was an anonymous tipper at that point, days after that, the eyewitnesses who were identified by Debbie Ramirez were trying to get a photograph of Debbie and them and to send it to the Post. So what was that about? These are questions. They're merely questions. The women make clear, you know, they're not drawing any conclusions, but they're questions that were never asked, never answered.
All right, Heidi Prisbilla, great reporting, eye-opening. Thank you very much. I want to bring in Sherilyn Ifill, President and Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and Nancy Gertner, a retired federal court judge from the U.S. District of Massachusetts. And Nancy, maybe I'll start with you because you had expressed a concern that was then echoed after the last time we spoke by former Justice John Paul Stevens and others, retired federal judges who call themselves conservatives, about the temperament on display from Brett Kavanaugh on Thursday, the wildly partisan fashion in which he conducted himself. He wrote a sort of apology, although not really an apology, in the Wall Street Journal. And I wonder if that assuaged you and how you're feeling about his impending confirmation.
I'd never seen a performance of a judge that one could say, a proposed candidate that one could say was disqualifying in the way that Judge Kavanaugh's performance was. I mean, it was not ambiguous. The notion that he shouted out the Clintons, that he talked about, you know, left-wing funders, a conspiracy. I think I mentioned in the column I wrote that when I was listening to this on the radio, when I first heard him, I thought he was a talk show host. I couldn't believe that this was a judge applying for this position. The canons make clear that it's not just actual bias, but it's the appearance of impartiality that a judge might have. And that was a performance that was unmasked. And what I worried about was that it was actually President Trump's idea of what a judge should be, as opposed to what a judge should be. And in the Wall Street Journal, that was already extraordinary, that he felt the need to write an op-ed, and the op-ed was so fundamentally disingenuous. He said that Thursday's performance was because he was emotional and acting as a dad and a husband and a father. That performance on Thursday was not spontaneous. He wrote out that talk.
Correct.
So the notion that you were swept away by emotion doesn't make any sense. The problem is you can't unring that bell. He was unmasked in a way that I thought fundamentally disqualified him from going forward.
Sherilyn, Susan Collins had a long section in her quite lengthy speech today about presumption of innocence. It's a theme that Mitch McConnell returned to. And I suppose the upside for you as someone who works for the Legal Defense Fund, that you have a bunch of new allies in ending cash bail and reforming the criminal justice system with functions daily on a presumption of guilt. So that's the good news.
Yeah, that's the good news. The bad news is that any one of the clients that we represent who did what Judge Kavanaugh has done, I think it's been now well documented that Judge Kavanaugh under oath testified before the committee, not just in the day that Dr. Blasey Ford testified, but also in his original hearing, and also in 2006, that suggests that he has serious credibility problems, that he did not tell the truth under oath about things big and small, whether it's about judicial nominees that he says he wasn't involved with, that he was involved with, whether it's about whether he received stolen emails from the Democrats when he worked for the White House, or whether it's what Renata alumnius means. We saw that too. We shouldn't forget that when he testified before the committee the second time, it wasn't just the intemperance, it wasn't just the brutality of his performance, but it also was apparent to anybody watching it that there were moments in which he was not telling the truth about things that he didn't think it was necessary to tell the truth about. So it's not just about the legitimacy of the court, it's our entire justice system. The justice system comes down hard on the kinds of people that I represent. Every inference is decided against them. Their credibility about things big and small is always on the line. When they are impeached, it matters. And yet we have now seen someone sit who wants to be elevated to the highest court in the land and who's a sitting D.C. Circuit Court judge play fast and loose with the truth and have a presentational style that was disrespectful and brutal in a tribunal, not something any of the people that I represent could get away with. So in some ways, it's really critical to remember what this unmasked today, not just him, but by going forward, by having Susan Collins make that presentation. We will see what the vote is tomorrow. I don't give up to the bitter end. But if he is placed on the Supreme Court, it demonstrates that our legal system is willing to tolerate a certain kind of behavior from certain kinds of people. Like he said, he went to Yale. You know, he was first in his class at Georgetown Prep. He worked his butt off. His story about his entitlement entitled him to play fast and loose and drive through the guardrails of our justice system that come down so hard on people who are marginalized and people who have no voice. And that's part of the fallout that we're going to see from today as well.
Nancy, there was another...
Right.
Yeah, please.
Well, and if any of the people who were before me that I sentenced, any of the defendants that I sentenced to substantial time had lived the kind of life that he had lived, they would have had records as long as his arm.
And not only
There's
that,
no question about that.
Not only that, on this temperament question, Sherilyn, to the sort of emotional.
Yes.
I mean, there are people who are innocent of the charges against them in courts across the country every day, and they are expected, whether they're 17 years old, whether they're people in the grips of substance abuse, whether they're you know, people that have been through lots of trauma, they're expected to compose themselves and not lash out in that courtrum, no matter what. You don't get to do what Brett Kavanaugh did, and that's expected of everyone, from a juvenile a perpetrator to anyone else.
There's a wonderful study about this, about the presentational style of African Americans in rent court in Baltimore, and the way in which the presentational style is held against individuals who are at risk of being evicted from their apartments. There is a whole constraint that the system puts on you, no matter what pressure you're under, that you have to present yourself in a way that is calm and that shows respect for the court. That was not necessary for Brett Kavanaugh. He could, and the Wall Street Journal op-ed actually was not an apology. No. It was a justification. It was an explanation that I get to do it because I feel that I was wrongly accused. You know how many people are wrongly accused in our justice system? And he thought that that was good enough. I get to present myself, and he actually thought it was something good. He described himself as passionate. You know, when you start using those words, that I was forceful and passionate, and you describe yourself in that way, you think that you did a good thing. And so I don't think you can't unring this bell. We can't unsee what we saw, and there are going to be consequences to that in terms of how people think about our justice system, how they think about the Supreme Court, how they think about what the rules are for who has to obey the rules that are set forth and who doesn't.
All right, Sherilyn Ifill and Judge Nancy Gertner, thank you both.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Unless something changes, Brett Kavanaugh will likely be confirmed at the Supreme Court exactly 1 month before voters show up to the polls for the midterm elections. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is here to talk about that next.
I'm not suggesting we're the victims here, Mr. President, but I want to make it clear to these people who are chasing my members around the hall here, or harassing them at the airports, or going to their homes, we'll not be intimidated by these people.
Mitch McConnell might think that women finding their voices and using their First Amendment right to petition the government is intimidation. But come next year, he could gain a Democratic colleague, at least in the House, who herself is a history of direct action. New York Democrat Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stunned the political establishment this year by winning a primary over Congressman Joe Crowley, part of Democratic House leadership. She's on the ballot for Congress this November, and she joins me now. How are you?
Hi, I'm well. How are you?
How are you feeling today?
Well, frustrated, upset, disappointed, but I'm also fired up. I think that we're going to be really committing very hard, not just to organizing through November, but also organizing through the next 4-6 years, I think. And we really just need to take this country and bring it back to the basics of democracy.
This was a theme today from Republicans about all these protesters there, which to me, you know, I sort of feel like